because the next one is Doveland, Wisconsin.
Oh, yay.
And this seems to be the one that really this is the one that I found first, and I was like, what? And this one seems to start in 2015, an obscure lab legend wiki.
Okay.
So once again, the stories themselves are beginning to be posted on these urban legend or fake story sources first, right? But when they're posted, just like that other one was posted like a news story, like, hey, I found this historical document. Can anyone confirm this stuff? This was posted the same way. This was in the strange Wisconsin Facebook group picked this up, and it was presented as, hey, listen, like, I'm not crazy about this, right? Like, you ever just do that sometimes when you're like, I know there used to be a show, like, I recently had a Facebook memory. There was this game, and if anyone can remember this game, please let me know. And it was, we're talking like the 70s, right? Like the late 70s. And there was like a little TV screen, like a light, bright-sized TV screen, right?
Okay.
And it was yellow. Like the image was yellow, like the old school monitors. And there was a guy on there, and he was in a cowboy outfit. And it went like, boop, boop,
not Oregon
boop.
Trail, though?
Not Oregon Trail. And it was a guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he would like do three.
At the same time Oregon Trail, though. Like that type of game.
I want to say even pre-Oregon Trail.
Okay.
This is like, and he would shoot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you had a gun, and the gun was connected to the screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your thing was you had to pull out your gun, or you had to shoot the gun between 3 and when he pulled his gun. And if you shot him, he would go, ooh, and he would fall with a little flower to show that he was dead, right? And if not...
Sounds familiar.
And if not, then he would go, rah, 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 and he would shoot his guns like this. I totally have a memory of this. I have a memory of literally playing it. I've got in touch with the mother who had to have bought the game for her son, right? They have no memory of it. I could not find any reference to it. I went down that rabbit hole for hours one day trying to find this game, could not find it. This devil is like that. These are presented. So they click into that button of like, yeah, wait a minute. You're like, I remember this. Doesn't anyone else remember it? And you're like, it kind of sounds familiar. Dublin, Wisconsin.
When people have memories, but they're not memories?
I don't know. Does anyone know what they call that when people have memories, but they're not memories?
Like everyone thinks that. What is it called?
I've been literally waiting the entire episode to either say the word or ask the question, and hoping someone, we've got like 17 different social media things opened up right now. Is anybody listening to us? What do we? I know the answer to the question. What do we call it when there seems to be a collective memory of something that never existed?
Right.
I bet you if I even said like the first person to give the answer gets a free copy of my book, still not going to get people on it, but I'll let you know in a little bit. How about that?
I don't remember the word.
No one remembers quite where it was in Wisconsin. I'm going to go Wisconsin like 7 times. Just slap me.
Yeah, they definitely don't say it like that.
They really do.
No.
They really
Wisconsin?
do.
No,
Wisconsin.
don't.
No, it's smaller, but it's Wisconsin.
Like the beer, like that.
This is an interesting term I came across, which is a hyperstition.
Ooh.
Right? Which is a hyperstition.
Like a superstition, but
like a superstition.
More? Smaller?
It's the fact that this belief, the belief in Dublin, is so strong that it might have actually created memories in people that don't exist.
Like that word we're talking about, but you won't tell me what it is?
You mean the Mandela effect?
Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's what it is. Spoilers.
It wasn't that exciting.
But this is actually like, not only that, but it goes one step further. Let me get into this a little bit.
Okay.
So this seemed to start primarily on Tumblr and 4chan. So once again, like not sources of fact, but rather for sources of let's share some stories. But they're always presented as, I can't get any response from the legitimate media. Can you guys know? I know you guys are into weird things. Have you heard this before?
Okay.
Now, it said that the government destroyed and removed all history. So this is now a direct one where we've kind of like theorized, like, oh, maybe like the government. This one, this part of the story is the fact that the government intentionally wiped this town off of the face of the planet and then washed it out of all of history.
Okay.
People have posted stories of being there, right? Of actually like getting merchandise, buying cups, buying hats, having owned hats. 2015.
That was when it was on the.
I'll get to the other times as I go with the narrative flow. Originally the post, the word Dublin is never used, and it's spelled Dove-land. It's never used. It's always a small rural town in Wisconsin. Does anyone remember this town in Wisconsin? And very specific government tests are cited in these early posts, right? But then, in other forms, people are citing the things like, oh, I remember that failed because of Project Elf. Like, that was a Project Elf cover-up and things like that. It's said, though, however, that if you are in the right part of Wisconsin, even though they don't know where it is, you can see the outline of the buildings and the outline of the city that used to be. Do you need a break?
I just want to stand up for
You can feel free. You can actually see the outline of where the buildings of Dublin used to be, even though it never actually says where it actually is in Wisconsin. So, where did this city go? Right? There were supposedly thousands, so it's not 607 anymore. Now it's thousands of residents of this town in Wisconsin. And
is it near the big city?
It does not say. It does not say. Because they don't know where it is. Like, they don't know where it actually is within it. So some say, the obvious theory is that this Dublin never existed. Never existed. It's totally an internet creation. It's never been anything. Other people say that a sinkhole ate it up. So you'll start seeing how some of these stories feed on each other. Mm-hmm. That's going to become important when we come back down to Florida. That all these stories kind of like feed off each other. And people even crisscross. Wait a minute, I thought I heard that. And they're thinking about Ashley, but it actually was Dublin's story. And so the other one is it was a military town. So there was a military base there. And when the military left, because their mission was somewhat secret, mm-hmm. the entire town went with it. Right? Like, the entire town was just the military base. And so they basically put everything down, salted the earth, moved someplace else. And so, like, there's really no record of it because the government doesn't want it. Some say it was, this is, once again, this relates to the Florida, that it was destroyed by damming, right? So it was a very popular city. What? Damming.
Oh.
So it was a popular city, or it was at least a populated city. They set up a dam somewhere else nearby, and because the water sources were marked off, the city literally and figuratively dried up and went away.
That's what Okeechobee. It's like a dam.
So
that's the word I couldn't think of.
Then, of course, you have, like we've talked about, the shifted dimensions, that it's a time slip, that mm-hmm. there is a time and a place where Dublin exists. We're just no longer there. And that when we see that city every once in a while, like in the distance and kind of like a misty thing, we're once again getting a glimmer of that old-time thing. The most popular theory is that it was a town that needed to be destroyed because it was the site of government testing.
Is there, like, military bases out there?
Well, there is one theory that's a military base. The other is just that the entire town was part of one large experiment. Oh. And because that experiment failed, they had to get rid of all traces that had ever existed.
So this one has more governments surrounding it.
Now, when you hear government conspiracy, do you think less or more of the theory? You know what I'm saying? Like, are you one of those people who thinks the government is actually doing this kind of stuff and has the ability to do this stuff? Or are you more along the lines of, like, dude, seriously? When you hear that stuff?
No, government definitely can do it.
Definitely. Right, and one of the things I posted was...
The government is
the government can't... You know, if anyone would say the government can't wipe a city off...
Oh, yes, they can.
Look at Pemberton Ferry. Like, we literally have the government coming in.
They get rid of a person, they get rid of a town.
Especially when you consider that the two projects, the two government programs that are cited in all of these different postings mm-hmm. actually did exist. And they existed in Wisconsin. I'm glad you asked.
Should we not be talking about this?
I think it's pretty safe.
Okay.
Don't give our address. The first is Project Sanguine, which was conceived in 1968. Now, The theory was, right? So you couldn't communicate, let's say, for example, with like submarines, right? Like you couldn't, you were trying to constantly come up, the government was trying to constantly come up to ways to fool the Soviet Union and other countries to be able to communicate, especially with submarines or things that were long distance, without doing it. And so they were trying to create bandwidths that could possibly do it, right? Okay. There's a lot of science. There's one whole thing in here that has the science of these radio waves. If you're ever interested.
You had a book.
Well, I'm not sure if I quoted a book. I think I have a book on ELF somewhere. And so the theory was, like, have you ever seen Crimson Tide? Yeah. So when a submarine wants to communicate, because it has to rise to the near surface of the water and it has to shoot up an antenna to get the signal. Yeah. But if they could perfect these things, they could actually project these low, they're called ELFs, right? Extremely low frequency waves. Ghost people know about them. If you're not a ghost person,
like radio technology, you know.
Right, and so if they could perfect these really long waves, then they could communicate long distances and through the water and stuff like that. So their theory was they were going to create this grid of cables, right? That was basically covered 6,000 miles of cables total, like this crisscross pattern, right? They were going to take this whole town, basically in the bedrock of the town, crisscross these wires, and then build a town over it, right? Okay. So that no one would even know that they were there, and then those amount of wires would use this extremely low frequency, and they would be able to communicate.
Seems like it should be underwater.
Well, they don't want it underwater because water is detrimental. Like, water is the reason why they want to invent it in the first place. They're trying to overcome water, so they don't want to put water in there anyway. Okay. But the problem was it was too expensive, right? Like, these 6,000 miles of cable and to run the power through them and all this stuff like that, it just wasn't cost effective. And, as anyone will tell you,
it didn't work.
Ghost people will tell you this all the time, extremely low frequencies, not good on your health, right? So if you imagine like the health concerns of like living near power lines and things like that, imagine an entire city with living on a power line. You know what I'm saying? Right. So these frequencies could mess people up.
Poison.
Exactly. Which led to Project ELF, which was kind of like the Great Value version of the. Do other people get the Great Value? Yeah, like the Dollar Tree or the Dollar General version.
Maybe say Jimmy Jack.
Version of this, which it was conceived in 1969 as like Project saying when they were like, this isn't going to work. And so they started doing this, but it began testing in Wisconsin. So that actually this really happened in 1982, right? So their idea was they went to Clam Lake, right? And they built this, like, essentially, like, this one area of 28 miles of wire in Wisconsin. This 56 miles of wire in Michigan, right? And this antenna would connect to this antenna, and it would create one big antenna. Kind of like shining a light from one part of the room to another part of the room so that you can get the whole room lit up. You know, kind of like the old mirrors of the Egyptian things, right? And it would create one big antenna, but these were above ground, right? So the reason why, like, the Project saying was below ground, had to be in bedrock. This one was above ground, and it actually worked from 1989 to 2004.
Wow!
So they were using these two different antennas in these two different states to communicate with each other, but it was crazy ineffective. And of course, isn't it amazing that it took the American government 15 years to be like, this is really, like, not working for us? Mainly because it was too weak, right? So even like generating from those two antennas, what they were producing was too weak, that it made it crazy slow, right? So to communicate these things, you couldn't say it would be like. Do you remember back in the day?
Talking through the paper cup?
No. I'm going one step above. I'm going one step above. Like when you would call collect. You would call your friend collect.
And say,
it's like, pick me up, right? Like, when you accept a collect call from, pick me up, right? And you, it's kind of the equivalent of that. You would have to throw out these things like, check your phone, like, or something like that, and so it was like, well, why have the communication at all if you can only communicate these really short messages? And And so, once again, it creates this idea. Now, the interesting thing is this, and this is the case for both Ashley and for Dublin, is that people thought that these things were real, right? And so people would search. So if you were going to search, right, how would you search to see whether Ashley was a real town? Like, what would you put into your...
I probably would look up, like, census 1930, you know what I mean? Like,
all right,
to get more, like,
you are way more advanced than most people. Okay, so let's say you put in route. Okay,
yeah.
So,
Or I guess maybe directions.
If
yeah,
you put
directions.
if you put real estate Ashley, Kansas, right?
Yeah.
That's what you're going to put on, and then you kind of look really quick, and you're not really paying attention. You're going to get results for a girl named Ashley who does real estate in Kansas.
Right. Then I'll go to the next thing.
But what's happening is you're seeing the results enough to click on to believe it's real, because what you're seeing is the results that seem to be real maps, right? That seem to be real because Ashley is the person who is in this territory right here, and the first line says the town of Ashley has disappeared. The one below it shows you a Google map that shows you something, and so you're like, oh shit! Like not only is there something saying it's real, but there's also something saying I'm also seeing a map of something. And so the way people were searching on Google was making them think that it was real because they weren't going through the search results.
Right.
They were just seeing a whole bunch of things pop up on their screen.
Yeah.
So they clicked on the first one, but in their mind they were still thinking, I just saw a map that showed Ashley. And so what they would do is then they would blog about it, and they would be referencing things, and so then the next result would be, and so the results were cross-pollinating with each other. Along with these keywords that were popping up, that people weren't putting things in quotation marks. So if you put, if you put Ashley and you spelt it wrong, so it was all of these. It's crazy, especially Dublin. People were getting, like, they would put in but Dublin, and then they would put in, like, they would hear like Project Elf. So we put Dublin Project Elf. Well, Project Elf was a real thing,
right?
And so they would get results for the real stuff about Project Elf, along with the fake things about this town that never existed.
Yeah. So it's all listed.
So then why do people remember having the shirts?
Because somebody made the shirts. Or like
That's
clip arted or whatever.
Right? So that's what people start saying. But think about this for a second. Unless you're weird like us or weird like me, 12 years ago, 7 years ago, are you buying a Dublin cup because it's a town that doesn't exist and you think it's cool? Maybe. But these people were saying my grandfather had it.
Yeah.
My sister who used to collect spoons had a spoon from Dublin. Like, in other words, they're talking about things that they remember seeing from years before
because they
it was ever a
went
story.
to Wisconsin and had a spoon, and they thought it said Dublin. But maybe there was Dove chocolate on the table next to the spoon.
Exactly.
Stuff
All
like
of
that.
these things seem to, because so many times these stories...
Your mind plays tricks on you.
So many times these stories end with, and I'll get back to you. I know I have it somewhere, I'll get back to you, but it's never gone. Now there is Dublin merch, right? Like I've posted pictures of shirts and cups and stuff like that. And so now when you look at it, you're like, well, was it real? If you're not critical... I mean, how many people are overly critical? And you look, and you go, and if you type in Dublin, Wisconsin, and you click on images, you're going to see all the merch, right? And so if you're not critical thinking, you think that these are actual shirts that exist, right? And,
now there's things that, like, they put any town or any name. You'll see, like, you ever get, like, T-shirts with your last name? Like, they must, like,
never,
insert.
But I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, like, they just insert.
Yeah, they just right. Like, and that's what it is. And most of these are, unless you click on the results and then look at the product itself, and you see that it's a print by demand thing.
Right.
And none of these things have kind of wear and tear to them, right? You don't see them online, and if you're not, once again, if you're not critical, you say, well, wait a minute, that's a brand new spanking shirt for a town that hasn't existed in 50 years. Right. So if you, or, at the most, what did it say, 2004 was when the government, like, decided to wipe it out. So 2004 is really recent.
Yes.
So if this existed in 2004, right, which it doesn't say that, that's where Project Elf ends. Why don't we have Dublin High yearbooks? right? Or why don't we have records of...
Because the government doesn't want it there.
So, and it was one of the interesting things, and I can't remember in what this was referenced to. I think it was absolutely brilliant. I want to get it here. The Dublin stuff, a lot of it came from the Stories of the Strange Unusual, written by someone named Lucia. I don't know if I'm just being Italian, it's Lucia, but it's Lucia to me, who did an absolutely amazing job. I'm going to post a link to the actual story because I really like the way this person writes.
Dublin?
But the Dublin story.
Okay.
And one of the lines she says is, lack of proof does not mean that something isn't true. Right? There's this crazy theory out there that the merchandise does exist, but that the universe created it to satisfy the urban legend. Right? Like kind of the ultimate next step, if you will, the merchandising step of tulpas and thought forms is that the merchandise actually has been created because the legend is so strong and has so much power. And backdated it, right? That you could go into
They're like paying guys to wear the shirt around every day for like months. So it looks like
you don't remember that, right? No, that like right now
I'll do that job.
In someone's attic is a Dublin hat from his grandfather, but the urban legend itself created the hat. That's that hyperstition that
How
I
did
was
his
talking
grandfather
about.
have it then?
Exactly. His grandfather never had it. It formed because of the legend. You know what I'm saying? Like that the collective intent that this stuff existed actually creates a cup somewhere in a yard sale in Wisconsin tomorrow. I don't know if I feel that strongly about it.
It's pretty deep.
But I do agree with the idea, with that question, it's mad deep, with that statement put out by Lucia, which is just lack of proof does not mean that something didn't happen.
Innocent
right?
proven guilty.
Kind of like that.
Kind of. That's kind of what we base our whole society
right?
on.
Because for the last almost 30 years, there's been a story about Okeechobee that, in my opinion, lacks complete proof.
It doesn't mean it's not true.
But it doesn't mean it's not true, and I know I'm going to get pushback for this, and I know I'm going to get people who are going to prove me wrong, and I want
right?
to be proven wrong on this. I want to be proven wrong on this because I have been, whatever you think, you're listening to the show, if you have no idea, you just have heard the story, you know, because you've heard it, you know it to be true. I've been spending the last 2 weeks looking for sources on this, and maybe my path is wrong. Maybe, I mean, keep in mind, I am a busy guy. You know what I'm saying? I got LOCs going on. I got, you know, the holes in my wall right now. My refrigerator broke. But in the early 1900s, sometimes the date or the year 1910 is cited.
So it's convenient when everyone's dead.
Hundreds of bodies were found in Lake Okeechobee. Okay? It began with the discovery of 50 human skeletons, and then this was during a drought type time.
Wait, hundreds of skeletons were found?
Hundreds.
Or bodies?
Hundreds of bodies. And skeletons were found, right? Like, these stories they're all over the internet. You can find them all over the internet. One is of a cat fisherman, and they would, and he found the body. Another one, the guy said the fishermen used to like throw their nets over, and they'd pull the nets up, and they would just be full of bones.
Okay.
Right? One of the famous lines you're going to find is that one guy describes it as there were so many heads floating in Lake Okeechobee, it looked like a pumpkin patch.
Wow.
Right? That when this lake kind of went down, there were hundreds of skeletons that were found, and no one has ever been able to say where these skeletons came from. No one has been able to ever discover or prove.
Could it have been like a cemetery?
Okay, so what do you mean?
Like a burial ground, just.
Of?
What do you mean of?
Wait, like who's obvious?
Native
Obviously.
Americans?
All right, so that's the going theory, right? Like that these have to be somehow Native Americans,
in 1910.
except for the fact.
In Florida.
Okay, because you're saying that right because Okeechobee is not vastly populated at that time.
Florida, yeah.
So.
If you find skeletons,
Like the leading, first of all, I want to say because I want to give some dates to this so we can get some kind of context. The first major telling of this is by Charlie Carlson, who wrote Weird Florida, right? But this is in a different book, although it does appear in Weird Florida as well. There's a different book called Strange Florida: The Unexpected and Unusual, published in 1997.
Okay.
Right? So that's like what? That's like 8 years before Weird Florida comes out. That he puts this story out there, and it's really hard to say whether he's quoting sources, and this is the problem that we've come up against with Charlie Carlson's work a lot. We don't know whether he's quoting sources that we can look at, right? Or whether
he doesn't have like
he's recording that he heard these things, but these are the stories that you hear are the ones he cites. I was talking to Joe Lipson, and Joe Lipson says this that kind of stuff. Time and time and time again, recycled and recycled and recycled. The story of the cat fisherman, the story of the guy throwing the nets over, the story of the pumpkin patch skulls, all that stuff. The same stories over and over and over again. 1910, sometimes 1900. Sometimes it's hundreds of bodies, sometimes it's 50 bodies, right? But there's always a huge amount of bodies. It's always, we don't know where it comes from. An important part of this 1910 expedition, or this 1910 discovery, is there are no artifacts found with it.
Okay.
Right? So in other words, there's no pottery, there's no tools, there's no arrowheads, there's no things, right? And so
but would you find those things in a cemetery?
Just want that to be known, right?
Okay.
So because one of the theories is like, okay, well it was a cemetery, right? So if you say it was a cemetery, who buries their people in water, right? So would the cemetery have to predate the forming of Lake Okeechobee?
You said the lake.
Is it runoff from some other place? Like it's some other place where they were buried, and then because as we've talked about, Lake Okeechobee both feeds and gets fed from all of these different sources and gives the water out. It's like the lifeblood of the water panel, or whatever they call it, the water scales. That was it from someplace else, and it just made its way down, and over time it gets buried in the dirt and buried in the sand and buried in the sand, because it's important to know that there is this mystique about Okeechobee and disappearances at Okeechobee, people falling into the water and never being seen again. I did a lot of research around this one story. It's called "Death Trap of the Sinking Sand" by Max Gunter. This right here, isn't that cool? You don't even know what it took to discover this. I was trying to search for, because it originally published in this magazine called True, a man's magazine, in 1964, and then it was republished. I have different dates, but republished in Reader's Digest. In researching the archives of Reader's Digest, I found out that in different places they publish different Reader's Digests.
Really?
So, because one says December of *64, the other one says July of '65. So there's a Canadian version and an English version, and then the American version. So they all have different things.
So cool.
But my good friend David Gunsword, he actually helped us, and I know I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I'm sorry, Dave, because he's always helpful. He's my serpent guy. I know, if anyone knows of an article that's out there about Okeechobee, he found it for me. He kind of sent this PDF for us. But essentially, 2 university students go into the swampy area near Lake Okeechobee, and one of them is engulfed and dies in quicksand. Right?
That's what this article.
That's what this article is all about. This is a story. Although it's weird in this story that they don't say what university they're from. They just say university students. Like, I always think it's unusual.
Well, what's the closest university?
But you can't say that. Like, oh, well, it had to be. Well, how do we know they weren't UF kids? How do we know they weren't Miami kids?
Yeah, I would think whatever the university closest to it is. Is there a university like right there?
It's in the middle of the state, so like.
UF.
Well, the closest one is probably what do you call it? It would probably now. I don't think it existed. I can't. I don't. It would be in the early 1960s.
Maybe it was the only university around.
Right now, I think FGCU would be the closest one.
No.
But that wasn't in existence back then, right?
No.
But whatever. Why not say the name? Like, why is it just naturally assumed? It's not like he's writing for a Florida paper, right? So they would know, like, oh, it had to have been. It had to have been UF, or it had to have been, because the lack of it puts.
What did she say?
Pause in me.
Just because there's no evidence.
Right, but why not? If you're writing the article, why wouldn't you say
because that just clutters up the sentence. Like,
I don't think there's any narrative flow. The sentence is two university students stumbled upon. Like, why not say two students from the University of Miami? You know what I'm saying? Like, two students from the University of Tampa. Like,
why are Miami students in the middle of Florida? Like, it just makes your brain click a little different.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with you on that.
Okay. Universities, it's just important to bring university students.
To me, to not put the details in.
Too much. You have too much detail sometimes.
Just like the story of the skulls, there are no reports that they were brought to a college. There was no. There are no reports that there are.
Yeah, if they're university students, why don't you bring them to their university?
Well, now I'm talking about two different things. There's two different things. I'm using one to prove the other, right? I'm saying, like, so there's a weirdness there. There's a weirdness around Lake Okeechobee. But it's like, where did these bones go? If there were literally hundreds of bones, where are these bones? And I know there may be an answer, right? Like, maybe they're in some place, like, you know, maybe the Calusa tribe, like maybe they're right down the street, the Calusa Mounds, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing that was throwing me off about
maybe
this.
They're in that museum.
If these were right, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Oh, you mean the Barnhart?
Yeah.
The Barnhart Hills? That's a good callback. That this idea of the. So you were saying, why does it make a big deal? There's not artifacts. Because the Calusa, who would have been the pre-Seminole tribe in that area, are mound builders.
Okay.
Right? So if you're building mounds and you're burying the mounds, you're burying things in the mounds, you don't bury them on the ground level of it, you bury them in the middle.
With their artifacts?
The shells would be artifacts.
The shells?
Do you get what I'm saying? Like the maiden, is that what it's called? Maiden? Like,
what are you saying?
What they call it, those shells are called, like, maiden, or something like that. Okay, alright, thank you.
Pause.
You can pause. Now, just so you know, you can take the lowest performing student in Lee County schools or in Collier County schools, and they will be able to speak so much more intelligently about the Calusa than we are. We're both like Boston people going like, I don't know, what the Iroquois, the Wampanoag, what are you talking about? The Calusa, I believe
let's get into the plantation.
I believe it's called Maine, right? And that's within it. And there were different ones for their garbage, and there were different ones for and a lot of things are like, oh my God, we found these mounds of the Calusa, and it's like, that was their trash, right? Like, so I just find it really hard to do that, to think of that. One of the reasons that they say, so I'm just going to put out there, and I'm going to spend nowhere near as amount of time on this, although it's going to be part of the legend trip part of it, as other people do, because when people discuss this, and a lot of people have discussed this story, very few of them have discussed the idea that the 1910 discovery is fake. Not fake, not real. I don't think it's real. I'm saying it, I'm putting it out there.
Because they didn't say the university.
No, those are two different stories. The quicksand one is in September of 1928, one of the worst hurricanes, otherwise known as the Great Okeechobee Hurricane, hit that area. Over 2,500 people, like 2,500 people were dead. 4,000 people in that area. 4,000 people in all, right? In all in America. More numbers if you include the people who died in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico, places like that. When it hit,
When you say America, you mean mostly Florida, though.
mostly Florida, yeah. When I say that, really, well, yeah, because it went up.
Because the other part was the
whole
Caribbean.
thing.
Yeah.
Thousands were killed before it reached Florida, actually, is what it says. It was a Category 4 with wind gusts or sustained winds of 160 miles per hour.
Wow.
Which I guess we can kind of go like, and, right? Like having
No,
lived
that's
through
bad.
Ian.
We know
160
that's
is
bad.
bad. Like we were at like, what, 174
It's bad.
at its height.
Yeah.
So, but 160 is pretty devastating.
And
16,
they
what it
didn't
amount
have
to?
houses. Probably some of them were in like.
Well,
shacks
right.
or
Well,
something.
that's a really important detail because
Yeah.
$16 billion,
No
16
hurricane
Canadian money,
windows.
$16 billion of damage done in Florida. Most of the damage and most of the deaths were on the south side of Lake Okeechobee.
Mm.
The majority of the people killed were African Americans living in Florida. Like a huge part of them were from the sugar farmers
Yeah,
and things like that. If you were ever in Florida, you know that's kind of like the dominating income there, right? Like you have the sugar festival and the brown sugar festival, and it's like those were sugar plantations. So African Americans and Caribbean Americans who were living there. No one took it seriously. It was destroying the Caribbean. It had devastated Puerto Rico, and they were like, who cares? Like it's kind of like this. Talk to someone right now about Clewiston. You know what I'm saying? Like Clewiston is used as always like oh yeah, the problem from Clewiston. Like those places, Moorhaven, all those small towns around, they're still to this day kind of looked down upon as like the lesser part of the state. Right? I don't know if you've ever experienced that or anything like that.
You just mean like lower income?
Yeah, it's just like looked down upon. It's looked like it's like that's like the hillbilly part, or that's like the rednecky part of the state.
Yeah.
Like all those are just, and so there wasn't really a lot of attention put into warning them, into preparing for them. They had gone through this weird cycle of droughts and rains and droughts and rains and droughts and rains. That when the storm hit, the dam, which was very, very small, was only I think 5 feet. Lake Okeechobee filled so quickly that it burst through the dam, and a lot of this was damage caused by floods, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these people died because of the floods. And then it was like, what did I say? September 16th. If you live in Florida, September 16th, it's still pretty damn hot. So do you remember we did the Labor Day hurricane? Remember the hurricane of 1926?
Yeah.
1926? 1935. Where it was the same kind of situation. This is like a few weeks in the year after that. Not in the same year, but I mean like in terms of the month. Heat. Now we're talking swampy areas. We're not even talking like the Keys. We're talking like the swamps and the plantations of Central Florida, of those inland Floridas, and so they don't really know how many people actually died because mass graves were created, bodies were burned, just like in the other hurricane.
Well, especially like farming communities.
Exactly,
A lot of people live there.
And they were just literally like the public safety was saying, you just need to burn the bodies, collect as many as you can and burn them. 674 were buried in mass graves in the Pauper Cemetery nearby. That is on Terraman Ave and 25th Street, right? So there's this kind of one location which was unmarked. People didn't. Not only were the graves unmarked, the fact that it was a mass grave was not readily available to anybody walking by, right? Until people actually fought to get a sign up and then eventually to have it on the registry. And now it is, as of 2003, there is a marker there. But weird stuff happens in that cemetery, right? Like people say they see, and this is a weird thing that they say, they never see anyone wandering around the cemetery or trying to get out of the cemetery, trying to get into the cemetery. They say they see these figures trying to walk out of the cemetery, which is something we haven't heard too much of, right? That they see these ghostly figures almost like in a zombie type situation, like moving to the gates, trying to get out of the gates, and seeming to hit like a force field and just stopping, and then they vanish. right? So we've talked about vanishing ghosts, this idea that they walk and they seem to pass through.
Yeah.
This seems to be more they hit.
And it stops them.
And it stops them and they dissolve. And this kind of thing is reported in that cemetery all the time. Other people were buried in Port Mayaca, West Palm Beach, and Woodland Cemetery. And for years after the storm, 1928, years after the storm, buried like bones from that storm that could be identified as kind of having been that age were still being found.
Oh my gosh.
So this idea, this is 1928. So obviously if the 1910 one is in existence, it can't be these bodies. It can't be the bodies from this hurricane.
But it could have been
gotta
another
be something
hurricane.
else. But it could have been another hurricane, right? Or it could have been some other thing, or it could have been one of the other things they said was that there was the Battle of, in the Seminole Wars, there was the Battle of Okeechobee, but there were only like 30, I think, people who died at that time, right? And they died like near Okeechobee, and so they thought like, oh, maybe there were those, but we're talking literally hundreds of bodies, so that doesn't account for it. So all these things, these towns, I've said before, I was going to tell you the list. These towns, after that dam burst, they built they call it the Herbert Hoover Dam, not the one in is that, where is that? Is it in Las Vegas? Is it in Nevada?
Yeah, Nevada.
Is it actually in Nevada? Have you been there? Did you go there when you
I
went
didn't
to?
go there, but
These towns all became ghost towns. Port Mayaca, Sandcut, Canal Point, Pachoki, Bella Grande, South Bay, Okeelanta, like that was Okeechobee and Atlanta mixed together. Rita Island, I'm not kidding. Lake Harbor, Chosin, and Creamer Island. These all essentially became no longer existed. And while they're not buried under the water, right? Because remember, this is where this all comes from, right? But I was originally told there was an entire city under the water, right? We've already established that can't be true because it's at its most and probably at its deepest in the wettest of seasons, 20 feet deep, right?
15 is that?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, that's the average. So, like, at its deepest, wettest time, it's so obviously you can't have an entire city buried under there unless it's buried under it. But the story persists. The story persists that there's some reason. Now, what I discovered was I think people are taking all of these things and kind of combining them and superimposing them. I don't think there's ever been any legitimate theory or legitimate evidence of a city, right? I think that if potentially that these hundreds of skulls and hundreds of bodies were found, then it could have been a burial site or a slide-off site. But I think the story of the city underneath Okeechobee is 100% a work of fiction. I think it was just some person or multiple people taking other legends that they heard, scratching their head and saying, I think that comes from Okeechobee, and kind of putting it on. So I really don't think that that exists at all. I was listening to a podcast called Let's Get Haunted, which was pretty good, right? Not as good as ours. I think you would love it. It's two girls.
Yeah, they told us about it the other day.
What did you say?
Someone told me about it the other day at the reading festival.
Oh, did they really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is that the one I took the picture of? I said, let me take a picture of that show. No? They say that people feel a heavy presence, especially on the south side, of being not alone, about being watched. Spirits and monsters. Fishermen have reported hearing singing and drums, right? And then they go to investigate, and they actually see what seems to them as if there are Native Americans dancing on the banks. But as they get closer to it, those people disappear. Now, the interesting thing is that while I have heard those types of lines over and over and over again, there is nothing ever specific. Right?
And
So,
specific about what?
what is the ghost story?
Oh.
Right? Like, this is a ghostly legend that's all set up with no delivery, right? Like, this is the foreplay without the post-play, right? Like, but no, because it's one of those things where it's like, it was a dark and stormy night. It happened on a road like this 10 years ago. The fog came rolling in. And then you go, so you know what happened then, right? And you walk away. Right? So I kind of feel like a little bit rejected.
Yeah.
And I know that you're like, honor the story. And here, there is no story. It's a ghostly legend with no ghosts. Right? With nothing specific. Now, like I said, there were some whispers about those weird ghosts that seem to be trapped in the cemetery. But that's not in Lake Okeechobee. That's not on the lake. right? And I couldn't even get like, well, do they hear ghostly boats? Is there a boat? Is there a... And it was like, it's the people say it's haunted, man. Like, yeah, well, what is it? It's just crazy haunted. Yeah, and spirits, monsters, like long tradition, right? And it's interesting because it seems to be a place that inspires so much folklore, but the folklore is so vague. So even Dave, when I was talking to Dave, said, "Oh, I remember this story about these extremely tall, like giant type people who somehow, like, because they were associated with Okeechobee, became giants." And it's like, yeah, and it's like, oh, that's the story, you know, like. Okay, but and we have the snake boy going around and around and around and forming it, which means that is it just because it's so massive that it has to be the source of this stuff, or do we just so not understand it that we can't get a handle on what the stories actually are? You know what I'm saying? Like the stories themselves are just like it's like he's really cool. Well, what does he do that's cool? He's just cool, man. You know, like there's nothing you can point to. It's
so you
try
to find stories about the haunting of Okeechobee.
Weeks. Everything that I've just said, every Okeechobee source, the Orlando Sentinel, the Florida Abandoned, like the podcast Let's Get Haunted, Dave. The only person I haven't contacted honestly because he's just had surgery is Mark Muncy. Like, has anyone ever heard a story? Has anyone ever forget about heard like, yeah, I was talking to Joe. Joe said this happened to him when he was on Lake Okeechobee, which I can even fall for that. But the story goes that on certain nights you can.
There's no books
And so the question is, can you legend trip with no ghosts?
Yeah.
Right? Like, can you go there and just be there and be the environment
and
itself?
You do that.
The environment. I can you do it.
I can do it.
Like, because
you always need to bring an article and have a story and.
But here the story is the fact that there is no story.
Okay.
Right? The fact that, and I know maybe I'm nitpicking, and people are like, well, all of these stories are vague. But I literally mean I cannot come across usually you can have something that you can handle, and it's one of those things. It's like almost like they say pornography. Well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, and then you get the feeling that this is like I can't tell you how it's haunted, but I just know it is, and that is friggin' intriguing to me.
Yeah, you have to go there,
right? Like that's the kind of thing. Because the thing is, it's not like we're not connected to people in Okeechobee. Like this is something that we can follow up on. Not only the entire thing. Now I forgot to tell you, in 2004 they found more skulls. Right?
Wow.
And when they found these skulls, they said they found them with boats, they found them with tools, they found them with jewelry, and they said, and by boats I mean steam-powered boats. They said there's 2 layers. There's at least 2 layers of bodies here, some of which could be 500 to 1,000 years old.
Wow. Wait, they made this lake though, didn't they?
Huh?
They made the lake?
No, the lake is completely natural.
Oh.
Didn't you hear Snake Boy made the lake? So it's one of those things. I don't know where the legend trip itself is going to go. I just feel like we need to go to the south end of Lake Okeechobee, which is probably the closest legend trip we've done in years.
What town
Ask
is that?
around.
Do you know this town? What town?
It's all those towns. It's like Okeechobee, and stuff like that. Yeah. Well, no, not these, because these are all ghost towns. These towns no longer exist, right? But it seems like it's a really good opportunity for us to go, put our boots on the ground, and see if we can actually get a handle on these stories. Like, instead of tripping on legends, tripping on stories. Like, actually see if we can go and discover these stories.
The legend?
Yeah, and it's interesting how much information I was able to gather on this, and how little information I actually have, right? Because it's so
kind of like these time warps you're talking about.
It 100% is, right? But it's also a product of, if you look at all the sources are the exact same that Carlson put out there, right? Every single, and the thing is, which is why I didn't want to do it, every story on it follows the same pattern. There were spawn, and there were bodies found, and they don't know what it is. Perhaps it's this, perhaps it's this. Let me now spend a really long time talking about the hurricane. But you just said the hurricane doesn't explain it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
it's almost like,
why did you do that?
Do you remember we were talking about Indian Springs Cemetery, and I spent so much time talking about Ma and Mama Gra, that you forget the fact that the story began. Why that's not the story, right? Like the 17-year-old who interrupts me.
Yeah.
The same kind of thing here. This also, much like Okeechobee itself, connects to so many other stories that we've covered. It connects to the hurricane story. It connects to the Palm Springs story, the Boca Raton and the Winda, because those are all the Pemberton Ferry. And the one thing we didn't talk about. I think we're going to end it here because I think I'm losing you. No, we're like legitimately losing you because we're on 146, so this is going to have to be a two-parter, right? There's one theory.
Dun, dun, dun.
If I had to say my favorite theory.
Please, do tell.
And if I had to say which one is most compelling to me, where these bodies come from. Because it's a story that's repeated someplace else in Florida.
Okay.
I know the answer to this question is you've never listened to the episode. So as I'm driving you home, I might force you to listen to it.
Okay.
There is the story of the singing manatee. Now, I know you've heard me tell the story.
Yes.
Do you remember where the singing comes from? What she says, and she's a Calusa maiden. Where does the singing come from? Do you remember?
What part? Where?
Yeah, like what did she say when he freaks out about hearing the singing on the Manatee River in Bradenton? Where does she say?
I don't remember.
She tells the story of her people long ago, who, in the face of an overwhelming enemy, felt it was more appropriate to kill themselves and throw themselves, by drowning themselves into the water, like by going into the water and allowing themselves to die, than to be taken prisoner. And so literally hundreds of them committed suicide in the Manatee River. There's a theory that either that's connected, right? Manatee River, and all water leads to Okeechobee, right?
Yeah.
But also, there's a story that the Calusa violently committed suicide and threw themselves into Okeechobee for the same reason. Once again, we don't know which legend is borrowing from which,
right?
Or whether this is a common practice of the Calusa. But the Calusa are so warlike. Why are they killing themselves and instead of dying in battle? That seems kind of weird, right? Like.
Yeah, but they're so badass they can kill themselves.
I get you, like a samurai kind of thing, or like a
kamikaze.
It's worth connecting, and it's every time I picked something up, it then became like, well, Lake Istapaca's like only less than an hour from there, and people disappear in the water there all the time, and bones were found there. And it was like, all these things like, well, what do I find? How many charts can I possibly print out of water made to do? I think it has something to do with the suicides.
Okay.
With that same kind of idea of the singing river, because the one story that you do hear is this drumming on the shore. In Okeechobee. Now, whether I don't have their sources on it, like where they got it from, but that seems to be like the one story that you can kind of follow up on is this drum ceremony that seemed to be happening on the shore, which singing river, drumming, ghostly voices.
Yeah.
It's worth exploring. I think we say I don't want to do hashtag Okeechobee because that's way too long.
Just because the word is long?
Yeah. Lost City? Hashtag Lost City? I don't even know. This is a legend, a haunted legend that I think we can track down the next month. I think we can track this down. We're gonna have to repost on our social media what the hashtag for this one's gonna be, because I have a feeling we could do this one before our birthdays.
Whoa.
We have a month and a half. I have a feeling we can do this before our birthdays.
Yes.
What do you think?
We can do it.
All right, excellent. If you want to prove us right, prove us wrong, make sure you're following us on our social media. You can follow me on Twitter. I don't even do the Twitter anymore. You can follow me on Instagram. I don't think anyone is. Instagram at Spooky Tripping, and of course on Facebook at facebook.com/trippingonlegends. Facebook, same thing, Tripping on Legends. If you're looking, we've got a whole bunch of new TikToks coming out and the like. We're going to come up with a hashtag for this one. We're going to go out there. We're going to hit the field with this one because I know you can go to the Okeechobee Library. If anybody has information on this, they're going to have it. It's a haunted library, too. Maybe we can sneak a little,
I think go to yard sales for some reason.
Why yard sales?
I don't know.
Okay, hey, hashtag follow signs. Girls love the yard sale. We're going to go yard sale. Make sure that you're following us. Make sure you're following us for this story and any other ones. Make sure you're going into the archives to listen to all those episodes. When I post this episode, I will post a link to all those different stories that seem to be connected to it somehow.
Okay.
So there's a lot to follow. It seems all paths lead to Okeechobee on this one. Maybe all paths.
All paths. I was gonna say
yeah,
that.
Beautiful. There we go. Then it's gonna be all paths for this then. My name is Christopher Balzano.
I'm Deanna Mulhern.
And here's hoping that all of your trips
are legendary.
We started with the debate up front. You gotta hit it over there. I'll make sure that you